Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to you if you're joining us for the first time. And also a warm welcome to people who come along to our events regularly. Like, there's no less warm. We're happy to see all of you. So thank you very much for being here this evening. If you haven't been to one of our events before or you don't know who we are, I'm Laura, this is Shelley, and we are the co-conveners of the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG. And we organise these events roughly monthly to talk about various different screen horror topics. We're really excited about tonight's event to celebrate Ash Clarke's new film, Fréwaka, and to talk about the rise of Irish horror. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our chair for this evening, Bernice Murphy, who is Professor in Popular Literature at the School of English, Trinity College, Dublin. So thanks very much, Bernice, for joining us, and I'm going to let you introduce our fantastic panelists.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. Hello and welcome, or if I use my very rusty Irish, I'd say Giadich agus Céad Míle Fáilte. That's the extent of my Irish language skills, but it is apt for tonight's discussion because we will be using Aislinn Clarke's excellent second film, Fréwaka, as kind of a springboard into discussing lots of really interesting issues related to the current wave of Irish horror cinema. The conversation will last about 50 minutes, and as our hosts indicated, we will have time for questions at the end. We have an absolutely wonderful lineup here today, who I know you're very eager to hear from. I'm now going to briefly introduce folks, and then we'll get started with a bit of a discussion about Fréwaka, and then we'll go into more general issues related to the Irish horror boom. So first of all, Aislinn Clarke is a writer-director from the north of Ireland. Her award-winning debut, The Devil's Doorway, which is incredible, was released internationally by IFC in 2019. Her second feature, Fréwaka, which is part of the reason why we're all here this evening, was released internationally by IFC and Shudder in 2025. And like The Devil's Doorway, it's on Shudder at the moment, and if you haven't had a chance to catch it, I really, really recommend it. It's brilliant. Aislinn teaches screenwriting and film practice at Queen's University Belfast, my alma mater as well. Shout out to Queen's. She was a 2019 recipient of the Academy's Gold Fellowship. So give us a wave there, Aislinn. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Secondly, we have our second Queen's person here today. We have Mervyn Marshall. Mervyn, would you like to reveal yourself? Hi, Mervyn.
Hi.
Mervyn is lecturer in film practice at Queen's University Belfast. His PhD with the incredible title Dawn of the Blood Craze. That's good, Mervyn. I applaud that. Focused on post-war anxieties relating to the family in British horror cinema. And in addition to his academic work, he's directed a number of short horror films, including the award-winning Banshee and The Stone Claims from 2024. So thanks very much to you also for being with us here today, Mervyn. And finally, our last contender here is Ellie Dolliver, who is a final year AHRC funded PhD student at the University of Cambridge's Centre for Film and Screen. Ellie, would you like to reveal yourself? Oh, sorry, you're there already. There's so many images on the screen. It's hard to figure out who's there. Her research applies theories from folklore stories to horror cinema. In particular, analysing the fairy tale style of the slasher subgenre, applying theories of folk groups to horror fandoms, and interpreting the online horror subgenre of analog horror. I'm a big fan. I think we all love analog horror, don't we? As folklore. So Ellie, and you also know a lot about Irish horror cinema. So thank you again for being here with us today. Without further ado, then, I'd like to maybe start, Aislinn, by subjecting you to a strict interrogation for a few moments, and then we'll broaden it out to our fellow guests.
Lovely, sounds great.
Yeah, I'll take it easy on you. Could you talk a little bit about the genesis of Fréwaka? I'm particularly interested in the fact that I think there's a sense we all know about difficult, second album syndrome. Did you find that, you'd obviously had that experience with making The Devil's Doorway? It was released back in 2018, 2019, wasn't it? Did you find that the fact that you'd had that opportunity to make a prior feature fed into your conception of your second feature in any significant way?
I think it is. I definitely did resonate, and I remember even actually saying the difficult second album at the time, because when you make one horror film and then you're told you're allowed to make a second one, and you never necessarily thought that that might happen, that someone might actually want to give you money to make another one. And then you feel more of a sense of responsibility to not screw it up, more of a sense of responsibility to yourself and to the audience and to your financiers and to your producers and so on, to not like make a mess of it and let yourself and everybody down. So I felt much more of that pressure with the second one than I did with the first one, because the first one is, it's a brand new thing out of the blue. You know, there's no bar necessarily, but the second one comes with that weight. So I did feel like that. And I remember actually having, just to be completely, you know, turning into a confessional here for a minute. I remember talking to my agent at one point, and I mean, everybody who's made a film at all, but especially a feature film, will have these moments where you think it's the worst thing that anyone's ever done in the world, and it should be burned and never seen again. And talking literally on set, like having a minor kind of panic attack. And he was like, Ashleen, don't worry about it, you know. And if it really turns out absolutely terrible, we can always figure something out. We can bury it. And it was like, it was never going to be as bad as in that moment, you know. So you do feel a lot of pressure. As to the genesis of where it came from, it was simply, I had written a film called Dinnin for Damien McCann, another director. That's an Irish language BBC film that came out in 2020, I think. And the producers of that asked me if I would consider doing an Irish language horror film, which I'd never thought of doing before. I had written other horror films, but that had not yet been produced. But I didn't want to just translate one and leave it at that, because I thought it'd be gimmicky. I didn't want it to be gimmicky. I wanted it to have a reason to be in Irish language, and to be kind of honest with that. So Fréwaka came from that essentially, because for me it's my very admittedly very subjective lens on Ireland, on Irishness, and where we are now kind of culturally as a people. And yeah, that's where it came from.
Do you think it's still the case, Ashleen? I think it's been kind of known for many decades that women tend not to be, female filmmakers tend not to be afforded the same opportunities, particularly as, you know, straight white guys. Like there's so many cases of women who've made really promising debut films, but for whatever reason, they've never been given the opportunity to actually make a second one. You obviously have, thankfully, been given that opportunity, and hopefully there'll be many more after that. But is it your sense, maybe this is a very broad question, is it your sense from your own experience that things are starting to change in that sense, that the opportunities for women to progress from their initial project
Yeah.
are more open than perhaps they used to be? That
Yeah, I think that definitely must be the case. I think there's still a long way to go, but I mean, actually makes me feel really annoyed when I think about the likes of Mary Lambert made
yeah.
Pet Sematary, and at the time it was the highest grossing horror film that had been made.
Mm,
She didn't get, nobody was, she said she got no calls. There was nobody phoning her saying, "Hey, Mary, make this film, make that film." That's crazy to me that that happened. It's like it was treated as if it was just a fluke and she couldn't do it twice.
yeah.
She returned to making music videos for a while. She made a number of other types of films, but eventually she made Pet Sematary too. But it's crazy. If that had been a guy, he would, you know, be ruling Hollywood right now at this point. It's nuts. And this the statistic that I was told when I was shooting my first feature was that on average it takes at least 10 years for a woman to make her second feature in any genre. And it's like that's kind of devastating, you know, because we don't live forever. So it just means that we get to make many fewer films. And I think that's really sad. But I think it's got better. There's still a long way to go. You do still see the phenomenon um, of men failing upwards, whereas women, there's a feeling that you have to. That comes with that pressure as well of the difficult second album, because you think, if I screw this up, that will be the end of my entire career. It's not like if I screw it up, oh well, and I'll do another one. You
Yeah.
think it'll actually be the end, because history has shown us that that is the case, whereas it's less so for men. It seems to be anyway. But I think there's more of an awareness of the disparity, and more of a desire. It's also coming down from the top, because Screen Ireland, for example, have particular systems in place, and they've made it known that they want to support women. So there are massive changes, but I think there's still a lot of residual kind of preconceptions about what women are actually like, what they're into, what they're good at doing, that aren't necessarily borne out. But it's a lot better than it was.
Yeah, it's great to hear that, you know, it sounds like some actual effective structural changes are actually starting to take hold in some pockets of the industry as well. Yet we're in a world where Eli Roth has made multiple films. I just want to ask one more question to Aislinn before we move on to and bring the rest of our wonderful panel in here. Aislinn, as you mentioned, Fréwaka is a film that is conceived of in Irish. It's not just translated into Irish, that the Irish language is actually fundamental to what's going on there. And I think many people in our audience, I know many people will be here from both Ireland and the UK and further afield. There's something really interesting starting to happen in terms of the Irish language, perhaps for the first time in our history, or maybe since colonization anyway, being considered a bit cool. You know, Kneecap have been incredibly successful. There have been several other high-profile Irish language films, particularly on Colleen Cohen a few years ago, which was nominated for an Oscar. How do you think the fact that the film, if you could talk a little bit more perhaps about the impact on the film's, I guess, resonance, how do you think that would differ if it were in English as opposed to primarily in Irish as it currently is?
I think that it would feel completely different. It's really hard to say because, you know, you don't have a crystal ball or whatever. And I think that there is a little bit of a moment happening where people, it's not even just that Irish is becoming cool. It's becoming cool in Ireland, where it certainly wasn't whenever I was at Gael School. It was not cool. It was far from cool, you know, by people who weren't at Gael School. But it's people elsewhere in the world, internationally, are understanding that there even is an Irish language. I think there was a lot of people who didn't even realize that, or that expect that it's some dialect of English, you know. So I think with Colleen Cohen being nominated for that Oscar and many more people seeing a film in the language was a massive part of it. And then Kneecap and all these things happened distinctly. There was no organized plan, because I know people involved with all of these films, and there wasn't any kind of, hey, let's take over the world with Irish language. It's, you know, at the genesis of the Kneecap project, I know one of the producers really, really well, and they couldn't know, they did not know it was going to end up where it did. So it's spontaneous and unplanned. I think that certainly Fréwaka is probably benefiting from that, because a rising tide and all that, and it's a boat on that rising tide. I think it would be a fundamentally different film in so many ways if it wasn't in Irish, because it's in the bones of it. It's there for a reason. Even in the title, Fréwaka means literally roots in English, but I didn't want to just give it the English language title for English language market distribution, because it doesn't have the heft and the texture of the word Fréwaka, which to me speaks more of like dense, heavy, tangled roots that you can't plant anything in the ground and they're difficult to get up. Whereas roots is quite, that could be a dandelion, you know.
Yeah.
There's a texture to the language, so I don't think it would have, it wouldn't be the same film, so I don't think it would do as well in any way.
Well, if everyone could learn how to speak a bit of Dothraki or Klingon, they could do a bit of Irish as well. I think that's
it's fair, yeah.
um, I mean, one of the things you've kind of touched upon there as well, and this is just maybe if we start with you, Ali, and then turn to yourself, Marvin, and then if Aislinn wants to chime in after that. Over the past decade or so, there has been a really remarkable groundswell of new Irish horror films made by writers and directors such as yourself, the likes of Kate Dolan, the great Kate Dolan, Paul Dewine, who did a really energetic, low budget, really exciting Irish folk horror film about 6 months ago. Chris Baugh, Nisa Hardiman, Ian Hunt Duffy. And then we've got more established directors, people like Conor McMahon, director of Ireland's first ever zombie film, which is fantastic. Lee Cronin and Lorcan Finnegan, who've both gone on to, you know, things beyond this as well, and have very well established careers. It's a long-winded preamble, a way of saying, I guess, the question that I'd like to ask maybe you, Ali, and then again, Marvin, if you'd like to chime in as well, is what do you think are perhaps maybe both the cultural and and I don't know, maybe if either of you could speak to the industry elements, or maybe that's something Aislinn would like to chime in on. What's going on here? Because actually, as a long-time horror fan myself, it always struck me as really odd that Ireland had such an incredibly rich and influential Gothic and horror tradition in literature, and yet was practically moribund for generations in terms of the horror cinema that we produced. So maybe, Ali, have you any thoughts about, you know, what's happening here? Is there some sort of, you know, magical spell or you know, we find some sort of formula.
That would be amazing. Obviously, I would love if that was true. I mean, it is hard to recognize whether there is like an actual like a wave happening or a trend happening, or whether you're just in an echo chamber and we're hearing so much about these films because we are like researching them at the same time. But it is like something is definitely happening in the last 10 years where like the quality of what's being put out is just like incredible. And films like Fréwaka and films like Kate Dolan's You Are Not My Mother, Damien McCarthy's Oddity are like as effective and accomplished and like well performed and like really, really frightening as any other horror that's being produced in the world. And it feels like we're in a really significant moment of like Irish cultural revival, and I don't know if that's, you know, again, just me like in my echo chamber, but like with sort of like Irish music and like Irish acting talent, it feels like, you know, we're even getting a look in like a lot of like transnational films, obviously like Lee Cronin and Lorcan Finnegan making waves on like the border stage, and like, you know, Irish folklore even getting like a little bit of a look in films like Sinners. It feels like it's having a moment, and I hope that but I hope it's not just a trend. I hope it's something more extended than that. But it feels like there is like a real moment of sort of national pride happening. And I think that sort of this wave of Irish horror is definitely connected to that.
Yeah, it was really something watching Sinners in an Irish cinema, and the moment where the
Yeah.
rock Dublin starts to play, it was actually electric. The whole cinema was like, ah, you know. Marvin, what about yourself? What do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of do feel like there's definitely the kind of momentum behind the kind of films that are coming out of Ireland, the horror films that are coming out of Ireland, that does actually kind of grant it that wave that, you know, in film history we kind of often talk about new waves. And I know there's that Fangoria article from 2022 that dubs the horror films that have been made in the last like 15 years or so as the new wave of Irish horror. And it, you know, it's funny, it's called the new wave, but it's really almost the first wave when you consider just the second wave, you know, because, you know, as Kim Newman's kind of pointed out, there wasn't much Indigenous Irish horror produced here prior to like the mid 2000s. So in some ways it is the kind of, we're kind of in ground zero here, and we're establishing a kind of national horror cinema in many ways. But yeah, I think there's a kind of shared sort of, I think the filmmakers that you've mentioned, Bernice, are kind of, you know, they're often kind of tapping into kind of shared cultural experience or subconscious. You know, they deal with many similar things. You know, they're often taking place in kind of rural landscapes. They're often dealing with folklore. They're often tackling kind of political issues or kind of maternal kind of crises at the heart of them. So there is this kind of shared kind of component to this kind of new wave of Irish horror that kind of does classify it as that. I also think with a lot of these filmmakers, they're kind of being dubbed, especially Aislinn and yourself, you're kind of being written about as a horror auteur, and I think that also kind of goes a long way to kind of identifying a new wave or identifying Irish horror as a particular kind of national strand. Yeah, I agree with you, Ellie, as well. I don't like the hope that it can evolve and it continue to evolve, and it's not just something that is kind of a trend. But yeah, it's really interesting to kind of see it happening in front of you, I think.
Ashley, what about yourself? Any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the industry and how the industry functions is central to that, central to why this is happening and why it's happening now. So Kim Newman quite rightly says there wasn't that much Indigenous Irish horror being produced before the mid 2000s. And I mean, you have to remember that historically, Ireland is not the richest country in the world, and filmmaking is very, very expensive. So we didn't have a massive industry to begin with. And then certainly when I was, you know, making my short films and all that, and kind of, you know, looking for film board funding, there was for a long time a kind of fearfulness from the funding boards to pile into horror, because I think horror, there is, I mean, I think we all know here that there is a kind of a snobbishness about horror. And so there was a bit of a fear of going there. So it was kind of not massively encouraged to a greater or lesser extent. And then I think there's been the dams have broken. It's a combination of the fact that there's been a lot more inward investment, big, massive American productions that have been shot here, which feed the infrastructure at its roots, which mean we have crews and post-production houses, and we have more money for filmmaking. And then the Irish were always, they just needed the money. They were always going to make horror films. It was like, it's only a surprise that it took us so long. And I think it's completely a financial thing. It's no surprise to me that there is a new wave. And it is a wave that's recognized internationally, because I travel a lot, and every place I go, people say to me, what's going on with the Irish horror? We all love Irish horror. It's a new thing. So it is definitely happening, but I think it was always in the stars for us.
I mean, just to go back to you for a second, Aisling, I don't want to give too much away about Fréwaka for those who haven't had the opportunity to see it yet, but I think it's fair to say, without any spoilers, that it touches upon issues such as the misogyny and repression which historically characterized the Irish state until, frankly, incredibly recently, and still, in certain aspects, still does. The role played by the Catholic Church and other institutions in these kinds of abuses. And I think maybe a little bit more obliquely, but there's that great scene where she's played by Breed, the older lady.
Like,
Yeah, she has the great monologue, and she touches upon various atrocities in Irish history, and she actually obliquely refers to colonialism and even the Troubles as well. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on there, as well as a big dollop of generational trauma, and of course folklore, as well. So my question to you then is that, do you think that in a way it's kind of inevitable that these kind of elements maybe can be dealt with a bit more, I don't want to say lightly, because I don't think they're dealt with lightly in your film, but a bit more deftly maybe within a genre framework than perhaps if you tried to do an absolutely, real, straightforwardly more realist take on this kind of material, where I mean there have been really excellent Irish films more generally that have dealt with these kinds of issues, but that in a way the genre topping is going to give it a broader appeal, perhaps.
yeah, I think that horror is really useful in that way. It's like as a mechanism for exploring really dense, tricky issues of like social trauma, stuff like that, because I guess you're using kind of the dream space and metaphor. You're not being completely direct. There's a kind of a filter between the person and the difficult issue at hand. So I think is it is deft is the word that you used, and I think that is the right word. And I think it's the best medium actually for getting into a lot of these things, for opening up a kind of cultural or social conversation about difficult and tricky issues.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's what horror does better than any other genre.
Good news, Ireland, like any country, has had its fair share of tricky and complicated issues. Marvin, Ellie, do you guys have any thoughts that you'd like to add in there? Maybe Marvin, you, and then I'll turn to Ellie.
Yeah, it's just sort of to kind of reiterate what Ashlyn said, I think horror has a sort of level of abstraction that makes it very kind of apt for dealing with certain issues. And this is something that kind of has a historical basis, but part of my PhD, I looked at the Hammer film Never Take Sweets from a Stranger, and that was a 1960s film looking at paedophilia and child molestation, which is a topic that was not discussed in the kind of mainstream culture. And it was a film that very explicitly had to work as a horror movie in order to be made. They had to turn the kind of monster at the heart of it, turn the perpetrator at the heart of it into a monster. So, historically there is that kind of need for horror to kind of tap into these kind of social consciousness, or kind of the kind of the feelings of a particular in group, and maybe sometimes confront them with that as well. I feel like quite often we get the question of like, why horror? And I think maybe in certainly in terms of some of the topics that we see recurring in Irish horror, it might be better to kind of turn that back and say like, how can you make a film about colonial violence or the Magdalene laundries without horror? I think it's maybe kind of, you need to invert that. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
struck me that one of the best films I've ever seen about colonial violence is Jennifer Kent's The Nightingale, which
Oh
actually has
yes. Oh my God. Yeah.
a significant Irish component, and actually part of it's in the Irish language as well. I'm sorry if anyone hasn't seen The Nightingale, it's incredible, and very harrowing with that caveat. But yeah, thank you so much, Marvin. Ellie, what about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, 100% everything that Mervyn and Ashton have both said, and sort of in the context of Australian horror cinema as well, it reminds me of director John Bell's comments about his short film and now feature film The Mugai, which he made recently, which is sort of based on like Aboriginal mythology, but sort of as a metaphor for like the stolen generations and sort of and the settler colonialism in Australia and the kidnap of Aboriginal children. And like the first thing is that you reach an audience who wouldn't sit down to watch a documentary about that, or you know, in this case, a documentary about the Magdalene laundries. And then he also talks about sort of, you know, it's an opportunity for the audience to experience that horror in a way really directly, that they might not through sort of a different medium, something like documentary, which I think works really well in the context of Fréwaka. And also what Aislinn has done with this film is like use the metaphor of Irish fairy folklore in a way that's actually really appropriate for the sort of paranoia and sort of the deception and sort of the machinations of the Magdalene laundries in the Catholic Church. And it might seem like sort of, you know, like facetious or something if you don't have a familiarity with that folklore, but once you know about it, it's actually a really appropriate metaphor, because it's this paranoia of an invisible threat and sort of these invisible lines that you can't cross, and sort of like an inescapable power. And it works really well in this context, and I think it's really effective in a sort of very personal, emotional way, in a way that another format might not be. So it works really well in this context, definitely.
And just to, you know, stick with that settler colonialism angle for a wee minute, Aislinn, if I might turn back to you, you're someone who, is it fair to say you've got a foot both sides of the border? You're based in the north, but you're, you know, you're half and half.
I'm half and half, a bit like yourself, pretty.
Exactly, yeah, we're hybrids, you know.
Yeah, and it is a unique position to be in.
But I think it's fascinating too that, you know, there has been this, obviously they're incredibly different financial industry context, cultural context that exists between the north and the south of Ireland. What's your sense of, I mean, I think one striking thing is that there have been a couple of, you know, horror films from the north, including The Devil's Doorway, The Eliminators, I think back in the 90s, which is by two brothers from Armagh who kind of made it on their farm, didn't they? See Marvin nodding, it's incredible. And The Boys from County Hell by Chris Ball, which is tremendously entertaining vampire film if you haven't seen it, with Tyrone accents so thick that you nearly need subtitles, and I'm from Armagh. Well, my question to you, Aislinn, is what do you, I mean, is it simply a matter of maybe financially or maybe creativity? There isn't, obviously the film industry is very different on that side of the border, that there hasn't quite been the same perhaps impetus or ability to support genre filmmaking. That clearly the South, there's been a decision made at some level, this kind of stuff, you know, it goes down well and it makes money. What's happening, your sense of what's happening, having worked in the north, of course,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, funded from the north as well.
Yeah, and interestingly, Chris Ball's Boys from County Hell was, I believe, primarily funded by Screen Ireland and not Northern Ireland.
Really?
Yeah. But I think it's, as so many questions in when it comes to films and the actual like practicalities of films, it's all about money, really. So Northern Ireland Screen has largely a different ethos to how they approach their, you know, what it is that they do versus Screen Ireland. So they're very focused, and they've done a phenomenal job, I have to say. When I was a film student, I graduated in 2004. There was no industry to speak of in Northern Ireland. Nothing. You know, one of our major post-production houses now was like, you know, doing DVD transfer and stuff like that. We didn't have an industry here, and Northern Ireland Screen worked to bring in big massive shows like Game of Thrones, stuff like that, which actually changed everything in terms of the money was there so that crew were here. There were people being trained as crew here. There were facilities popping up to manage these big productions, and then they're still there when we're making our short films and so on. So that's kind of where they put their focus, was on attracting inward investment. And I guess there's a kind of a trickle down, not to use that phrase, idea there that it will eventually serve us well as filmmakers, and it has largely, or to some extent. Then in Screen Ireland and the Republic are very focused on, they do that also, but they're very focused on nurturing and investing in the grassroots of talent. So it's a really different kind of outlook, you know. So you tend to get more money for shorts, a lot more money for shorts from Screen Ireland, for example, than you do from Northern Ireland Screen, and they'll finance bigger chunks without needing co-investment and stuff for feature films as well. So that's a massive part of it, just the actual practicalities of the financing and how these organizations work. Yeah, so I mean, it's a boring answer, but that's the truth. It's about money and how it's parsed out, but also the fact that the North is a lot smaller than the South.
Yeah.
Fewer people. And then I think in the North has the added complication of having had, the Troubles as well for a long time. And there was a reticence to dwell on too much dark matter, I think, in the aftermath of that as well. So it's not exactly in step with the Republic yet, but there's a lot of crossover between the two, obviously. I mean, Fréwaka was completely financed by the Republic of Ireland, Screen Ireland, TG Cara, Commission to Man, and places like that. So yeah.
Yeah, and maybe a sense that, and particularly during the days of the Troubles, all you needed to do was look at the news. You didn't need any horror films. Reality was grim enough for so many people. I mean, Marvin, you're based in Belfast, and you've made films of your own. Have you any thoughts about what it's like on that side of the border?
Yeah, it's kind of. I was actually having this conversation not that long ago with a screenwriter friend of mine, Stuart Drennan, who is one of the writers for Hope Street and wrote The Dig, the 2018 The Dig, and he has many thoughts about NI Screen and Screen Ireland, and I asked him about this idea of, is there such a thing as a kind of a Northern Irish national cinema, and he said from his perspective, from his point of view, if you were to ask NI Screen, if there is a Northern Irish national cinema, it would be the kind of maybe like a dark thriller or like a kind of psychologically underpinned crime film. So like Bad Day for the Cut, Stuart's The Dig, Black Medicine from 2022. And I think whilst not horror, they're maybe more kind of better viewed kind of like as like a parallel to our TV shows. So like Line of Duty, Blue Lights, which just won the BAFTA, Hope Street, those kind of police kind of procedural kind of TV shows, and they sort of are a spin-off from that. So I don't know if it's, as you said, Aisling, just a kind of reluctance to kind of dip our toes into more trauma and more horror, but I would suggest not. I think we've got quite a lot of the horror scene here. The horror viewing scene here is very vibrant. There's a lot of kind of horror themed clubs like Ghouls on Film, like Fright Night Society, NI. There's multiple kind of horror themed festivals. The Dark Hedges International Horror Film Festival. So there is a hungry horror audience in Northern Ireland. So it's just not being represented in that particular strain of the industry here in terms of Indigenous feature films. In short films, there's lots of horror kind of coming out. I do kind of wonder if we're maybe just a bit behind down south like usual. So maybe in the next 5 to 10 years we'll start seeing a kind of particularly kind of Northern Irish vein of horror kind of develop, but who knows,
Can I just clarify that when I'm talking about like Northern Ireland Screen and their ethos and everything, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what people actually want on the ground. That's not linked to things like the North Coast Dark Hedges Film Festival and stuff like that. Those are things that happen organically, and it's not, the two things are not tied together, if you know what I mean.
Well, maybe now they've got the glider buses sorted out in Belfast city centre, they could devote excess money from Stormont to horror.
That's a horror film, being on a glider.
That was a local deep dive if anyone's ever been to Belfast. But we've got bendy buses now. It's very exciting. Ellie, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I mean, I'm from Cork. I'm from literally the other side of the country, and people from like the Republic have a really bad habit of pretending they know loads about the north of Ireland and actually not knowing much about it at all.
I've just been to Newry for the shopping. Yeah.
But I'm really excited to hear you talk about The Eliminator, because that's like my white whale. I can't find a way to watch that film anywhere, and I'm so fascinated by the idea of zombie St. Patrick. So if anybody has like an old mob file of that on their computer, please tell me. I know there's other like low budget, kind of no budget zombie movies like Battle of the Bone, if you guys have heard of that one by George Clarke, but again it's like 150 quid on eBay, because I think there's probably 3 copies of it anywhere in the world. But yeah, zombie horror in the context of the Troubles, the two communities must fight together to survive the zombie outbreak, and there's parkour in it as well, I think. So that's the extent of my knowledge of horror from the north of Ireland.
Yeah, the Illuminator was kind of Marvin. I think you were indicated maybe you've seen it as well. It was kind of like almost like a early Peter Jackson type vibe about it, wasn't there?
It was when I was working more in the industry, it was commonly kind of shared amongst the crews on in various states. I've never actually seen the whole way through, but I've seen large chunks of it on phones in the kind of back.
Someone needs to make a film or sort of a mockumentary about, like a horror mockumentary, The Search for the Eliminator. That's an idea
Finding
for
the
you.
Eliminator.
Yeah. If I might, talk generally to everybody about, we seem to be we're in the cusp of a wave or a boom or something or other anyway, a rippling, whatever you want to call it. It strikes me too, though, that with the Japanese horror boom, we're all probably familiar with the fact that, 10 years into it, Hollywood cinema and Japanese cinema and Korean cinema were inundated with, very damp girls with long hair covering their faces. Arguably too many of them ultimately. There was like all waves it crested, and obviously they're still making incredible films, but there was a sense that things had sort of moved on. My question to you guys, and maybe you'd need to be psychic in fairness to be able to predict this, but do you think there are any elements within the current, in a general sense, within current Irish horror that might perhaps be in danger of being overly played or becoming essentially Irish horror cliches? I mean, Ellie, you've done a lot of research in these, not in not in my moan specifically, but this strikes you as maybe things to watch out for in Irish horror cinema in that sense.
Yeah, well, I suppose because in the context of my research, I look at the representation of Irish folklore in horror cinema, and I focus especially on Irish fairy folklore and sort of how the social function of that has sort of managed to survive and evolve through adaptations in horror cinema to address more contemporary things like climate collapse and sort of like Ireland's national identity in like a globalized world, whereas it would have used to be used for understanding things like mental and physical illnesses and child mortality and things like that. So I see a lot of Irish fairy horror, but really like the people.
I mean, they are terrifying in fairness.
I mean, it's really
You don't want to mess with them.
Yeah, and people are very original in their approaches to it. Like even though there's a lot of them now, every single one is unique, and everyone is so creative. Even in the way that people do the character design is so creative. Everyone is so different. And in general, I think even though we've been talking about like Irish horror cinema as a wave, it's actually really diverse. The different genres that it intersects with. You've got your rom-coms, and you've got like your science fiction, and you've got like a lot of psychological horror as well. I think that it might be fair to say there's slightly more supernatural horror cinema in Irish cinema as opposed to psychological horror, but generally I think it's really impressively diverse, and I don't even see like Irish fairy horror being cliche at all, because it's such diverse tradition. There's a million different things you could pick out of it, and the way that Aislinn has approached it in Fréwaka is totally original. It's not anything that's been done before, even though there's such an amazing tradition of films like The Hole in the Ground, You Are Not My Mother, like all completely different movies. And so I think it's not like a well that's going to dry up anytime soon.
Yeah, we do have that very, very rich seam of folklore and mythology to draw upon, luckily. So there is that, I'm thinking too of something like Sea Fever by Nessa Hardiman, which is very much, it's a great example of a film that, like Fréwaka, is out there very much doing its own thing. I mean, it's like an aquatic horror film. It's sort of like with very interesting eco-gothic elements as well. I mean, Aisling, just to turn to you for a second, was this something you were ever aware about? Because obviously you're someone who's very much of the new wave. You're kind of like, maybe, I don't know, when do we see it began, but maybe towards the beginning of the new wave, if we might call it that, of a sense of very much wanting to kind of put your own stamp on things.
I didn't really think of it like that, because I think that as a filmmaker, you can't think like that. Because there are going to be so many people who are thinking like that are holding doors closed in front of you, that it's not your job. There's going to be distributors, producers, sales agents that are all going to be prioritizing audience response. I think I think the audience doesn't want to feel like they've been given something that is pandering to what they want. I think they want to see something new and fresh and feel surprised. So I think the only thing that you can do is be honest as a storyteller, and just tell the truth of the story that you want to tell, and not put the cart before the horse by making it primarily about whether or not this is the right thing to do now. That's just how I approach it. I think I would do a disservice to the audience if I tried to do it the other way around. I think horror audiences can smell being pandered to. They can smell the kind of cynicism of being given what people think they want. And as I say, you're going to have to navigate. And this is something that people who aren't in the industry don't necessarily know how many hurdles you have to navigate as a filmmaker. So if you write a book, for example, you have to deal with like your, editor or whatever. But if you're making a film, it's never ever going to be the Fabergé egg that you've slaved on and that you've made perfect. It's always a lot of compromises and different voices before you actually get it out there. So I think on one hand, it's not really any of my business whether or not it's going to hit a certain mark, but also I think that in terms of fairy lore, every time we get like something new, like essentially this is a new monster, okay? It's something that we haven't seen a lot of in horror film history. So why can't we have 200 of them like we have with vampire movies?
Yeah.
Because as Ellie quite rightly says, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of different stuff that you can do. So, and I think when things get overused, like the Japanese examples that you raised there, I think what people are responding to, the exhaustion, is actually about the market becoming aware of the thing that's working in an honest sense and trying to use it against the audience, trying to use it to manipulate the audience. It feels cynical, it feels flat, it no longer has the power that it had. It's not about the tropes of Japanese cinema, it's in how they're beginning to be used by the exploitative market. So I think that's why I say it's none of my business whether or not the audience are going to like it, because I don't do them a service or myself if I look at it that way.
I mean, do you see the potential then, to have a mediocre, cynical American remake starring someone like a third-tier character or something from Stranger Things, like that, that they've put it in English and they've called it Roots.
I think thankfully horror audiences are the one audience that have always been happy with subtitles, and they don't mind foreign language at all one bit, and hopefully that will never therefore happen. It probably didn't need to happen with those movies either, as we all know, but I don't see it happening.
I think it's a great point, and an underappreciated point actually about genre viewers. They will put the time in. They don't mind having to, having to pay that little bit of extra attention. Thank you so much, Aislinn. And Mervyn, did you have anything you wanted to add in there?
I think really, Aislinn and Ellie really kind of nailed it. I would say more in terms of like, how do you try? I mean, you can't really ensure anything, but how do you try to keep Irish horror from kind of hitting that kind of saturation point that J horror kind of had maybe 20 years ago? And I suppose it's just down to for me anyway, but it's about the formal innovation. As Ellie, as you said, there's an incredible diverse mix, not only tapping into this rich folklore and folk history of Ireland, but also in the genre hybridity and the innovation there, but also Aislinn, with your films like The Devil's Doorway, you totally repurpose the kind of found footage film to really deal with such a complex and horrific kind of cultural trauma, so it's about kind of that, I think formal innovation and looking inward and looking at our perspectives and understanding is kind of the way to sustain Irish horror without letting it kind of reach that kind of point where it's reduced to banshees and leprechauns and changelings.
You just reminded me that the Leprechaun franchise exists, but maybe we'll not go there. In one of them, he goes to space. There you go. Getting down to the last couple of questions that I have for our team here, and then what we'll do is we'll turn to the chat, and I will try to read and speak at the same time, which is always a challenge for me. But we'll see how it goes. Just sort of feeding off that, do you think there are any aspects of Irish culture or history or everyday life that as yet haven't had the chance to be depicted in an Irish horror film? I mean, I was interested just on a practical level, actually, that your film is mostly it's in daylight. The vast majority of the film it's lovely and bright, and if we were speaking before the thing began, the weather's really nice, and actually you get a totally erroneous view of Ireland, but it's actually like it's really pretty and warm. But what about a sense that there are certain things that it just hasn't had the opportunity to go there yet? I'm thinking that a lot of Irish horror, I think for very obvious reasons, a lot of it to do maybe with folklore and mythology, has often tended to be rural settings. There have been a couple of films with urban settings. I'm thinking of the likes of Ciarán Foy's The Citadel, which wasn't set in Ireland, but sort of in a kind of a everyday or sort of a broader urban space. But I thought that was really interesting. There was an Irish filmmaker dealing with directly with, you know, living in a kind of a dodgy neighborhood and the anxieties that go with that. So yeah, anything that you'd like to see maybe or you think would be interesting. I'm thinking too historically, you know, there's so many interesting and terrible stories that we have that haven't been told yet. I mean, Ellie, is there anything that strikes you as maybe potential rich themes for Irish horror what we haven't quite gotten to yet?
Yeah, I completely agree with your point about the urban. You know, whenever we do have sort of Irish horror films in urban settings like the Canal or Citadel, or even like potentially Vivarium, because obviously the short
Oh yeah, yeah.
BAFTSS was based on sort of these Irish ghost estates, and then when it made it into a feature film, it was suddenly like an anonymous, like no place type landscape. There's like a tendency that to sort of believe that sort of like an urban landscape is not like properly Irish in the same way that certain commentators have suggested that like a horror film isn't properly Irish. So that would be nice to see. I think maybe more like urban and suburban Irish horror. I also thought maybe obviously there's like a wealth of historical trauma that could be turned into Irish horror cinema. But I also thought, you know, if you guys remember watching the first episode of Normal People and sort of that crawling in your seat, sort of feeling like it was just too close to home, it was so recognizable. I think that would be fun to see in a horror film as well. I'd watch a horror film that sort of begins at like a Gaer disco zombie outbreak that begins with like shifting 8 people at a Gaer disco. I think that'd be great. There's a lot
Yeah,
of
that was
yeah,
maybe
like
for our
comedy horror, and I think I expect there's like going to be a few more comedy horrors in the next few years as well as the more serious ones. I think that's nice, and it's nice to see like the confidence there to start doing that.
Yeah, I've never been able to watch Normal People because a lot of it's set in my actual workplace, and I just
Whoa.
during lockdown, I was like, I can't watch this. Partly the rooms in the college are a lot nicer. Not that ours aren't. Anyway, before I incriminate myself, yeah. So you said GA Disco. That is the GAA, the predominant sporting organisation, or one of them in Ireland, and yeah, we call it the GA. So in case anyone's wondering what that is, we've just had a big controversy allied to this about women not being allowed to wear shorts in an allied sport called. It was a big news. It got to the New York Times. So. Maybe that's a film. I don't know. Mervyn, what about yourself? Just leading off, not the camogie angle necessarily, but if you think that would work, by all means, pitch it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think Eamon Byers just kind of highlighted how much of Irish horror, this new wave of Irish horror particularly, is kind of a maternal horror, and it looks at, you know, issues not only relating to kind of Ireland's like kind of ancient and recent past, but also just dealing with kind of motherhood in the 21st century, and you know, I wonder if we'll see a kind of masculine answer to that, or response to that emerge at some point. You can, Ellie and Aislinn will be far more kind of learned than me in this case, but I don't know. I can't, off the top of my head, I'm sort of struggling to kind of think about Irish horrors that really focus on the masculine space. So.
Just that sort of savage, that urban, that was a good urban horror. He sort of gets mugged and castrated, and the whole movie is about reclaiming his masculinity on this like Brendan Muldooney, I think.
Oh, and the other, sorry, but there's another Irish horror film released this year that's also an Irish on Tabsha. Am I pronouncing that correctly? And it's very much actually about sort of fatherhood and things going a bit wrong. So it's an interesting portrait of masculinity. Without wanting to give too much away, there's a big house and a father and a daughter, and it's kind of, you know. It's kind of famine times. Anyway, we don't want to give too much away, but yeah, that's it. It actually does touch upon that as well. And that film you mentioned, sorry, Ellie, what was it called? Savages, did you say? Oh,
Savage. Yeah.
Savage. That's interesting. I haven't heard of it. I'm going to write that down. I haven't come across that one. Aisling, what about yourself? Is there anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think probably the one thing I can think of that hasn't really, well, I mean, because we have a lot of trauma, a lot of different layers. There's a lot of different layers, even just in the kind of famine era and mass immigration and stuff like that, which has been dealt with in various small ways, but there hasn't been like a big one. But I think the actual big one for me, and which is going to be the subject of perhaps my next one. I'm working on something at the minute that's about the Troubles.
Hmm.
And I think again, it's that feeling of it being horrific enough as it is, in the way that the Magdalen laundries are horrific enough as they are. And I navigate that conversation every time I do a Q&A. Somebody will say that to me, but I think taking on tricky things like that is a really useful thing to do and important. So yeah, I think a Troubles horror film is needed, actually.
And it's kind of shocking in a way that it hasn't happened. I mean, we don't even really have a tradition of horror writing. I mean, there are I mean, think of some like Owen McNamee, right now, these incredible gothic inflected thrillers about the border, but full on horror from the north and actually even from the south in a contemporary vein. There's not a hell. That's a whole other topic maybe, but there's not a hell of a lot of it actually.
Milkman by Anna Burns has elements in it that I would say are horror. It's horror adjacent maybe, but yeah, there hasn't been anything that's kind of gone full throttle into dealing with that. Probably because it is so recently traumatic as well. But yeah,
There's a brilliant short film that came out in the last year or so by Leonard Soberman, who is a Belgian filmmaker, but also did a postdoc here on the Troubles and its kind of influence on the kind of modern film industry. His film's called Dragon's Teeth, and it's sort of one part horror film, one part essay film, and also sort of like an ethnographic study. It's a kind of he took oral history of a community that lived around a kind of massive army fort that I think it's in Armagh. And it's sort of about a British Army soldier who disappeared there, who's kind of notorious within the local community, and he disappeared during the Troubles, and people had memories of seeing him after he disappeared. And he's made this wonderful kind of ghostly essay film where the soldier comes back and walks around the kind of deserted, decaying army fort. It's called Dragon's Teeth. Actually, I've told you about it. I'll get the screener link off Leonard and send that over to you because it's really beautiful.
yeah, I'm interested.
Is it based upon the real life the Captain Iraq case?
It might be,
very
yeah,
famous-
yeah, it
Yeah.
might be, yeah. I'll double check that with him, but it's brilliant. It was on the Belfast Film Festival with my film Stone Claims, and then we did a festival in Brussels that was on Irish ghost stories together. So that was where we kind of spoke about it.
Sounds really fascinating. What I wanted to say just to maybe wrap up is I know that we've got in our audience here, we probably have at least some people here who are, and certainly a lot of people who are thinking about, Irish horror, and there may well be people here who are be they Irish or based in Ireland or working on it, whatever, thinking about their own approach to maybe a creative project to do with horror, be they in the middle of it or beginning it or just vaguely percolating. But my question to you guys, and maybe if we start maybe with Mervyn and Aislinn first, as you're kind of very much on the creative coalface, and know Ellie, and then if we come to you, Ellie, as well, after that, is there any specific advice, specific and succinct advice that you would give someone who was approaching their own creative project of a horror nature? Anything, that seems to you like sensible advice to pass on, or aspirational, or both?
I think from my perspective anyway, I don't know how useful it's going to be, but I think that the only thing that you can do is be like genuine. I think it's a grave mistake to I'm assuming that everybody who's on this call is interested in horror, but sometimes I see people who don't really like horror but who think they can make a horror film because they think it'll be easier somehow or something like that. It won't be. I think you have to be honest. There's something about horror that just has no space for cynicism or manipulation. So I think if it's coming from, in order for it to feel horrifying, it has to be something that feels horrifying to you because you're ultimately communicating kind of an emotion, an inarticulable something. So I think that's really the only advice I have apart from just do it and grab it by the horns and all that. But yeah, be honest about it.
And Mervyn, what about you?
Yeah, kind of in the same vein of what Aislinn's saying. I would say just kind of look out at everything as a potential site for horror, and steal everything. Like just anything that you can come across that's not nailed down, steal it, sharpen it, repurpose it, and make it very specific to your experiences. And in there will lie the kind of truth of what you're trying to get at. I'm one that likes to bring in different forms and things that wouldn't naturally kind of be considered horror. So Banshee was kind of, it's like Legette, it's all photographs. With the Stone Claims, that was like an ode to the Cassavetes kind of heroines, the general and sort of characters. So to me, it's just like, no one can take that from you. Find your influences and just kind of flip it and think about it as in terms of what it could be as a horror film.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marvin. And finally, Ellie, what about you?
I mean, I haven't made a film in a long time, but maybe if you're doing it with like a smaller budget, don't try to do everything by yourself, even though it seems tempting to try and do everything, and sort of trust other people. And I think like the value of collaborating on stuff like the soundtrack especially and the score is like testified to in Aislinn's film and her collaboration with Dee Hexon. So yeah, trust other people and don't try and do it all on your own.
Excellent. Very, very helpful advice, I think, from everybody there. And Dee Hexon, unfortunately, couldn't be with us here tonight, but I just want to shout out, Aislinn, as well, that your score is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it adds, and I know you worked with Dee a lot on, obviously, as any, but I think maybe even more than some directors do to get that particular atmosphere that you were aiming for in the film. Would you maybe just like to say a little bit of that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, it helps that Dee's a really good friend of mine, and we just have a really easy mode of communication, and we like a lot of the same stuff. And I can spend a lot of time with Dee, and I can articulate something in a very abstract sense that doesn't make sense to anybody else, and Dee will be like, I know what that means. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like this, So it's a kind of a it's not like a relationship that I have with every creative that I work with, or I don't know how you'd replicate it. It's just, yeah, but I really treasure that. I think Dee's a genius. So brilliant.
And I hadn't realized till I was looking at these sort of CV online that these actually scored several of the more prominent films from the Irish. You Are Not My Mother, and there was one other one as well. I've forgotten the name of it. Oh yeah, Double Blind. Yeah, the scientific experiment one, isn't it? So yeah. So shout out to all the other creatives, I should say, that are obviously very much hard at work on films. That's about it.
Sorry, I have a wee question for Aislinn on that, actually. When you were working with did you give them the foot, like, did they see a rough cut with temp music and you asked them to, because when I did Banshee, I gave a lot of influence. I didn't let the score or the composer see the film at all, and I just kind of dropped the music over top of it when I felt it was kind of appropriate. But I kind of wanted to know because it's so.
Like Dee was like hand in glove all along, from an early stage, and was seeing early cuts and even rushes and everything, because I think I wanted it to really feel like the tone of the film was coming from the film. So yeah, totally very involved. But I mean, a part of that again is because we are good friends too. So not every composer will give you all that time, so yeah.
It absolutely shows. The music's just phenomenal. The soundscape in general is just, yeah.
Thank you. I think Dee did a phenomenal job.
It's one of those films that if I was listening to it with Bluetooth headphones, I think it would actually nearly be too much, which I consider a compliment. So
yeah, it is beefy.
I tried watching Skinamarink in a dark room with headphones, and I nearly had a panic attack. So that's my limit. On that shocking personal revelation, what we'll do is, if you could please post your questions in the chat, but put question in front of them so it doesn't get lost in the mix. Okay, so we have a question from Alice. Hello, Alice. Alice is doing her PhD with a focus on contemporary horror cinema, and she's particularly interested in the fact that many of these stories relate in Irish horror cinema, as we were maybe touching upon earlier, relate to or about motherhood. And so this is a question for you, Aislinn. Alice asks, I find it incredibly interesting that in both your films, the characters go through a traumatic experience of motherhood or are crucially separated from it. Was this aspect intentional? Is it a conscious choice to take women and gender-specific experiences more directly as a woman filmmaker?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I get asked sometimes about like representation and women and stuff like that. And the thing is that and actually I haven't spoken about this to other women directors also. There's kind of I can sort of speak for all of us to some extent. It's like we don't come at it from that direction. It's not like we start out thinking, I'm going to write a film. I'm going to write a zombie film. How do I represent women within this film? It's just that we're just human beings telling stories. And because we are women, I think we might have primary characters that are women, but we're not. It's not that was there at the outset. It's just that we're telling stories, and that's naturally how it unfolds, if you know what I mean. And for example, with Fréwaka, the primary cast are all women, and that's just how it is. It's how the cookie crumbled. It wasn't about making a statement particularly, but nobody says to John Carpenter, about why are there so many men in the thing, I think it's interesting. And the thing is that we all respond like that. And it's interesting to notice, like, to think about why we think like that. But in terms of motherhood, I think that so much Irish trauma, particularly Irish trauma, that women experienced is located in motherhood. There's so much with the Magdalen laundries and I'm actually pulling a total blank on that procedure that they used to do with separating the pelvis. There's like
cystectomy or something like that, was it? They used to break
symphysiotomy. Yeah, there's a whole history of really brutal stuff there. And while simultaneously the Irish mammy, we all know, was holding everything together and the one keeping it afloat. So I'm interested in mothers and representations of mothers for those reasons. But also I think there's a lot of women in particular who are responding like that, Irish women. I spoke to some women who'd applied for the Perspectives scheme Screen Ireland are doing and had been told that there were too many mother stories. And I think that's a great shame, because it's like we have a lot of stories to tell about mothers, so it is what it is. But yeah, I don't know if I actually answered your question or not, but that's, yeah.
I mean, my follow-up to that, Aislinn, is what's your take on Mrs. Brown's Boys as a Irish horror?
I've never seen it, but it does seem to be pretty horrific. For every time someone references it, they do it with a shudder. So I'm guessing it must be horror.
I have a colleague who once gave it a negative review in a radio program and practically got death threats. People are really into it. Anyway, that's a whole other panel. We have a follow-up question here from an anonymous listener viewer. Hello, thank you so much. Billy O'Brien's 2005 horror film Isolation. I think that's the one with the vet and there's experiments on a farm, isn't it? Ellie, maybe you could confirm.
There's sort of like a down on his luck farmer forced into a lucrative but doomed scientific experiment that results in like a zombie cow fetus that rampages around, and it also has Irish travelers in it, and it's got like a racial element, and it's really scary. It's really good. I would not have interpreted it as having a fascist aesthetic. As a question, did you want to finish reading out the question?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just going to provide a context for our audience.
Yeah, so that's what it's about.
Wasn't it Ruth Nega's sort of first breakout film, the wonderful Ruth Nega?
Yeah,
So the question is, Isolation portrays rogue science. It's always rogue science. You never get rogue literature, do you? As a threat to tradition and the land. Is this not a fascist aesthetic? So I guess, yeah, we maybe start with you. That's kind of maybe a question for the general panel. So thank you so much, questioner. Any thoughts on that then? For those of you, Ali, I mean, if you want to continue maybe what you were going to say about it there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not the impression that I got from the film. I don't think it has a fascist aesthetic. I don't think the farm is presented as like a sort of safe space of tradition and conservatism and like the family and sort of like the safe Irish version of like traditional conservatism. I think it like does a really good job in sort of reframing the agricultural industry in Ireland as dangerous and lonely and difficult and hard and really hard, and that's very much reflected in the cinematography and things. So for me, I think it's like it's maybe anti-fascist in that way. It sort of works against sort of stereotypes of the pastoral idyll that people might have, a sort of tourist vision of Ireland, which I think is like a positive deconstruction. But maybe other people read it differently.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Marvin, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, I have not seen Isolation, unfortunately, but after Ellie's kind of descriptor, I'm all over that. Zombie cows, excellent. Sign me up. Rogue science, sign me up.
Could be a double feature. What's that New Zealand one? Black Sheep, which I believe is zombie sheep. So you could have a whole
on a farm.
And there's a lot of evil pigs in horror, but again, that's a whole other thing. Thank you so much, questioner. Yeah, so do we have, oh yeah, we have one commentator who's pointing out that Justine Nakase has written a lot about Ruth Nega's star persona. So she might have written about isolation somewhere. Thank you very much, Mairead. Yeah, any other questions from our audience? And we do have more time here, so if you've got anything, this is your almost final chance to get these burning questions about Irish horror off your chest. I mean, one thing that occurred to me, Aisling, if I might, is that I was wondering if at any point you were placed under any pressure to kind of water down the more local aspects of your film to make it more internationally accessible. You know, I mean, it seems to me the film is quite accessible as it is. And it does, like any good film, it demands attention from the viewer, which, you know, I think the viewer should be very willing to give. But was there ever a point where there was things that you were maybe asked to reconsider or explain or to take out, or can you speak of such things?
Yeah, it was actually a pretty unique opportunity in that regard because it was financed primarily by TG Carr's Cine Carr scheme, which also made the Colleen Kuhn. So the purpose of that scheme is they do want the films to go out into the world, but they're not trying to make them mass market in a way that elides their kind of Irishness. So I didn't. Whereas under normal circumstances, you may well have to put up with that. I didn't with this film. It wasn't a barrier that I had particularly. If
Okay,
anything, it
that's
was more like, yeah, they wanted it to feel really Irish.
yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Ashen, but just for viewers who mightn't be familiar with TG Car, it is the dedicated Irish language channel, TV channel. So they do really good documentaries. Is one thing that they do. Everyone always talks about. So TG Car does a lot of like sports coverage, very good weather, but also documentaries. And now I mean, are they increasingly going into film then, or is it maybe one or two a year? Because they'd be quite fairly low budget, wouldn't they, as an institution?
It's a big part of why Irish language is having a moment, I think, because historically the programming that TG Carr did, and I used to work in TV myself, it was more about creating content for the Indigenous audience that speak Irish or are interested in that. Whereas the Cine Carr scheme in particular, which I think the first film that it made was Aracht in like 2018 or something like that, which is a famine set horror adjacent film. The point of the scheme was to make films for an international audience that would get distribution, that would go out into the world, that would present the Irish language to the world. And they've been really successful at that.
Mm.
You look at, you know, the films that they've had, particularly on Colleen Kuhn getting the Oscar nomination and so on. So yeah, that's what they're about now.
Yeah, I had seen someone earlier in the chat mention Welsh horror, and there's an incredible Welsh horror film from a few years ago called The Feast, and unfortunately I have no Welsh, so I can't say the title in Welsh. But it struck me, I wonder, will sort of the Irish example be used to maybe encourage other, you know, European filmmaking in Indigenous language, you know, I guess minority languages. That example, obviously Wales is outside of the EU now because of Brexit, but that's a whole other horror story. But yeah, it might be interesting to see if TG Carr's approach has maybe picked up elsewhere.
There have been conversations like that for
Really?
sure. Yeah. I mean, St. Maud is sort of a Welsh horror film in a way. God speaks Welsh in St. Maud, which is really fun. But yeah, I know that those places are looking at Ireland and going, "Hey, they did that, we could do that." That's definitely something that's happening.
And now that poor actress is trapped in that terrible Lord of the Rings adaptation, or not adaptation. Don't get me started. She'll be okay. She'll be okay. She was in a folk horror. She'll be okay. I have a question here from maybe a controversial question, which I'll slightly rephrase. But an interesting one. Is it acceptable that an English actress played the lead in Nessa Hurricane's Sea Fever? Is it acceptable to have a non-Irish person depicting an Irish person on screen? Yeah, any thoughts from our panelists there? I don't know if particularly is it considered to be potentially objectionable if it's an English person in particular, but you know, given the interlinks and how many of us Irish people of English descent and many English people of Irish descent, I don't know. I think it's quite a complicated question. Ellie, why we pick upon you as our Cambridge
I mean,
correspondent?
no, I guess it depends who is finding it acceptable or not. I feel like maybe the person asking the question doesn't think it's acceptable. But of course, like
Yeah.
it's a really small country. A lot of Irish cinema, let alone Irish horror cinema, is sort of necessarily co-productions with other national funders, and that includes the UK a lot of the time. So if we weren't making movies with other countries, we, you know, it's a collaborative art form. Of course, it's okay to have someone who's not Irish playing an Irish character. I think maybe it depends how it's done, but yes, I think it's okay.
I mean, my recollection of that film is that I didn't even know that that actress wasn't Irish. She got the accent right, which I think for me anyway as a viewer, there's so many. We can all pick up egregious examples of Irish accent abuse. Angel and Angel, David Boreanaz trying to do a Galway accent, I think forever scarred many of us. So, you know, if you get the accent
Maybe in that case, no.
yeah. Yeah, I will say, like, for instance, like Rebecca Ferguson in Doctor Sleep, there's a really good Irish accent, actually, for a Swedish person in particular. But apparently her mother or granny was from the north or something. I don't know, Mervyn, do you have any thoughts on that, or Aisling, before we pick another question?
Well,
Aislinn, you
well,
go.
you go ahead.
No, your perspective's way more interesting than mine.
Well, all I was going to say is far be it from me to criticize another director's choices, you know. I think it is what it is. And as you say, Ellie and Bernice, as long as it doesn't feel cardboard and a bit plastic patty, then I'm okay with it.
What was that film, At Wild Irish Time?
Oh,
Which
yes.
apparently it's the one thing with Emily Blunt and somebody else, and you know, but apparently it's one of the most horrific examples of people who should not be attempting an Irish accent. Anyway, that's a whole other panel. We have quite a lengthy question here. On maybe just slightly, it's a great question just from Emer. Emer struggles. She teaches Irish horror, and Emer, as she puts it herself, a possibly irrational dislike of Irish comedy horror. That's fair enough. This is a safe space, Emer. You can vent here. She said, I'm not talking about films with witty elements like Shrooms or Oddity, but stuff like Grabbers or Boy Eats Girls or sorry, The Boys from the County Hell. She feels that they lean too far into tropes of comedy horror and dispel, I suppose, the creepiness. She feels that seriousness and honesty that Aisling was alluding to is a kind of core requirement for horror, and in these cases, it's missing. So the question that Emer has for you guys is, do you think that she is do you feel any discomfort yourself with Irish comedy horror? Is there, you know, because there have been some notable examples of that.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start. I totally get where this is coming from, actually. It's not my favorite thing either. But I think it's all about for me, execution as well. So like would we call something like The Lost Boys a comedy horror? I mean it certainly has elements that
Mm.
are quite fun. But I think the monsters, the vampires in this case, are very sincere. They're they're real vampires. There's no lightness to how, and they really will kill you. I think maybe sometimes when the monster is teeth are taken out a little bit when there's comedy coming from how it works as well. It's not my favorite thing, but then I mean, you know, that's just subjective, I suppose.
Grabbers has the whole let's play upon the cliche of Ireland being a nation of alcoholics, and it's a film, you have to get drunk to survive the monster, don't you? There's like a, so it's,
Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not.
yeah. I actually liked it much more than I thought. I have a problem with a lot of comedy. I don't just find a lot of comedy in general not that funny myself. I did actually laugh at Grabbers at certain scenes.
Well, that's a good point because the reality is that most comedy films that are made are probably not very good
Yeah,
in general across the board.
yeah.
And we need
I
to
think there's only about 5 of them that are actually in the history of comedy. But that's just me.
petition to have a category called elevated comedy where we pick out all the good ones and then everything else is just comedy.
Ari Aster's next film. Marvin, do you have any controversial takes on comedy horror? Should we be allowing it, is what I would say.
I mean, I think, you know, we have to sort of, we are kind of a nation of storytellers, and our comedy and our humor is a big part of our identity. And I think it's only natural that it kind of finds its way into the horror films that we make. I think as a kind of educator who teaches film practice, I'm predisposed against comedy horror because at least every year I get probably 5 or 10 students who want to make comedy horror, and I have to sit them down and I say, look, you're going to do comedy badly and you're going to do horror badly. Please just pick one, you know, and most often they don't ignore me, and then we're stuck there fake laughing at their screen. But you know, I can sort of see it's kind of maybe it's a kind of nervousness, I think, from inexperienced filmmakers to fall back on. I think quite often comedy horror, I think it's a vein that kind of taps in, that has a pre-built audience, you know. And yeah, so not the most kind of articulate response there, but I sort of, yeah, that's kind of my feelings on the genre.
I mean, is there the case to be made that a comedy horror film will work if it gets the horror right first and foremost, and then the comedy elements are right? I'm thinking of something like Ready or Not, which I have seen about 20 times. I watch it whenever I need cheering up, but it's also a proper good horror film. Like, it's
Yeah.
genuinely a good horror film, and you could take the comedy elements away and it would still be a good horror film.
Mhm.
So if you haven't seen
I
it,
think there's a lot of truth in that, yeah.
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 Yeah, that's what I say to my students, you know, is that you have to, this has to work as a horror film as well as a comedy. So, you know, the horror can't be like deliberately shit. You know, it has to work as a horror film.
I mean, I do want to ask a follow-up question about horror musicals, but maybe we just be getting into. We have Nia here who points out that Wales is already following the Irish model, it seems, and Film Cymru, apologies again for the lack of Welsh, is funding a number of a small number of Welsh language films on an annual-ish basis, and horror is apparently well represented there. So that's really good news. Just going to scroll down here. Who else do we have? Someone, Nia, is also shouting out a dark song. Oh, a dark song's gorgeous. A wonderful Irish Welsh horror co-production. I don't know if our panelists have seen a dark song. Really incredible, a cult film actually. Very painstaking, a ritual being prepared. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. Kind of a slow burn as well, I think, in quite an interesting way.
I really like A Dark Song. I think it's one of those films that it's an independent horror film that would actually be kind of hard to get financed now potentially, because it is a slow burn and everybody wants horror beats like every 10 pages kind of thing. It's Rosemary's Baby. I have this conversation a lot. It wouldn't get made today by an American studio, not in 1,000 years, because all the horror is concentrated at the end. And I think A Dark Song is a little like that. Although there is a sense of dread the entire time, and in Rosemary's Baby too. But yeah, it's a really interesting Irish horror film.
Yeah, and a little bit like your film, Ashley, it's kind of a two-hander for much of it, you know, but so obviously the acting and the direction and the script is really paramount there, isn't it? I mean, yeah. I'd really encourage people, if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's a remarkable film. We have a question here for everyone from Alice. She's finding that a lot of Irish horror, understandably, she says, includes zombies, vampires, and werewolves. Are these films taken by you as seriously as the ones that use folktale and Irish exclusive myths and creatures? So yeah, Irish, if anyone would like to speak for Irish horror scholars as a collective, do we take vampires and zombies and that kind of thing, the more broader horror monsters, as seriously as our own stuff and our own issues? Ellie, what about you? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think of course, because you know, if you're gonna be a snob about zombies and vampires and werewolves, then it's too late and you're already a snob about horror cinema. That's like the bread and butter. So I don't think there's no point in like constructing a hierarchy. Obviously, it's really interesting because I do folklore studies to like read films that incorporate folklore, but there's like a whole every single sort of film, Irish film that like adapts zombies and vampires and werewolves. Um, Irish horror film that adapts werewolves. Actually, I'm not sure if that exists.
And The Company of Wolves, I guess,
Oh,
is
yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah, I was trying to think what werewolf one do we have? Yeah.
And potentially, I guess, Wolf Walkers, but obviously that's a kid's film, but it does draw on sort of Irish werewolf folklore. They will have something to say that's really valuable about like sort of Irish national identity as well. There's not like a strict line between those things and like serious elevated horror movies for me.
I will say that when I was a kid, Irish TV, we only had two channels for much of my childhood, and they only seemed to have three horror films, and one of them was A Company of Wolves, which they showed every Halloween for about 15 years. So I feel like it's embedded in my soul. I've had to watch it that many
it's really
times.
formative for me too, but because I was thinking about this earlier. My primary memory of, the old experience of going into the video shop and renting videos in the 80s was seeing the cover of The Company of Wolves and taking it to my dad and saying, "Can we get this?" And him saying no every single time because of the woman that's half wolf and has like the six boobs. And this is a man that let me watch The Exorcist and everything, but he was like, "No, can't watch." So I didn't see it until I was like 20.
Yeah, Johnny was a man of firm boundaries, viewing wise.
Weird boundaries, but firm.
We have another question here from a previous questioner who was asking, I think it's the same person who was asking about sea fever. Is it a problem that filmmaker Randall Plunkett is also Lord Dunsany of the storied Dunsany family, and people maybe aware of his great-great-grandfather was, or forgive me if I got with the family lineage, was a great writer of fantasy, influence in Lovecraft, I believe. Can ascendancy cinema take a rightful place in the canon? So big question for you there. Any thoughts? Ellie, what about you?
I haven't seen a Randall Plunkett's film, so I feel a little bit,
Yeah, he did a zombie short that was shown at Horathon. I've seen it myself a few years ago, and apparently he's now made his first feature. So
there you go.
He's made a
Well,
couple, I think.
my instinct is yes, again. And again, it's more complicated than this is a problem, and so we can't include it. And like cinema is transnational now. We can't construct a hierarchy of good Irish cinema, bad Irish cinema.
yeah.
The country's too small. And
I mean, it's arguably actually quite problematic, isn't it? If you start gatekeeping and say, well, certain people are more entitled to make films, Irish, an Irish narrative than others, and but yeah, that's all right. Marvin, what about you? Any?
Yeah, I probably agree with Ellie there. I think as a country, it's about we should be constantly we're such a small nation. We should be constantly looking out for perspectives and kind of let that kind of rather than designating a hierarchy of good or bad, let that kind of organically be kind of arranged by the culture that kind of consumes them. So yeah.
Yeah, I think him it's a very singular experience. There's not an awful lot of people knocking around who are a baron, like he is, inheriting the title Lord Dunsany and the estate and the castle and the history and his ancestor's head in Drogheda Cathedral. It's Randall, or Oliver Plunkett was his like.
No.
Wow.
So in a very niche way, it's a
Wow.
singularly Irish perspective. So
That's
I
the
mean,
greatest thing in Drogheda. That's if you ever go to
that
Drogheda,
horrified all of
greatest thing
us.
in Drogheda.
You know, it's like we all were took to on school trips. But anyway, it is an Irish perspective. It might be a very singular one, but it is an Irish perspective.
Yeah.
And I think if you
Mm.
once you get into kind of once we start defining what is an allowable Irish experience that isn't, that feels wrong and very reductive to me.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, on that point, given that Ireland in the last 20, 25 years has gone from being an incredibly homogenous nation to actually welcoming many new Irish from all over the world, I'm sure they're already in the works, Irish set horror films, Irish horror that it's coming from these new perspectives as well, and they should obviously be, I'm sure people would agree that they're equally valid, Irish stories. Thank you so much. A very, very interesting question, panel or questioner there. I think that we'll wrap it up there. I don't know if our panelists have any final pithy comment or last minute revelation that has occurred to them, which they want to get out now. This is your final chance, your final countdown. If not, we will, I think, just anybody feel like the teacher in Ferris Bueller. Anybody?
I have some shorts to plug that I would
Okay.
yeah. recommend because I think as we know as scholars, short films are important, particularly in the North, which is like a kind of post-conflict kind of society. So those films that can be made without those kind of politics of feature film financing and distribution. So I would love to recommend Farmers by Freddie Layden, which is a really surreal look at a kind of community that's plunged into grief after the death of a farmer. Very, very strange. Never seen anything quite like it. And the wonderful Mel McCluskey and Thomas Bennett's film In the Wake of John Doyle, which is a bit like some of your work, Aislinn, a bit like The Devil's Door. It's about a priest that's returned from the dead, and they shot on Hyatt and Rathlin Island. So it's again very rooted in the kind of local. So some short films to keep an eye out from.
Excellent. And I think on that note, if we maybe ask if Ellie or Aislinn have anything they'd like to plug and or recommend before we let you go.
Yeah, thank you so much for those recommendations, Mervyn. I hadn't heard of any of them. I will plug Cork Horror Shorts. If anyone hasn't seen Damien McCarthy's early short films. Damien McCarthy, who did Oddity and Caveat, his student short films and his early short films are on YouTube, and they're some of the scariest short films I've ever seen. There's one called Hungry Hickory, and there's one called Never Ever Open It, and they're both terrifying. There's also one called Lamb by Sinead O'Loughlin, which is more like psychological horror, and that's online as well.
And Ashley?
Well, I've got a film called Fréwaka that I've made that's out there that you may or may not have heard of. So yeah, that's what I'm plugging at the minute. And
Excellent.
everybody else's stuff, all the other Irish stuff that's out there. There's so much great stuff being made.
Yeah, and I will say too, I believe, is it only in the US or is it more generally that The Devil's Doorway is also on Shudder,
It's
Ashley?
everywhere.
Okay, yeah. I use VPN, so I don't never quite sure what version I'm
I'm
watching.
telling you.
Yeah, I pay for them. It's still perfectly legit. We have finally Josh. Thank you. Josh has just pointed out that Jack Rayner's film Bonya is a great famine horror based on Japanese horror tradition. That
Oh,
sounds
I
really
haven't seen
interesting. And I believe he's the supposedly American but very Irish looking chap from Midsommar. I would say, but you know, if you haven't seen Midsommar, it's coming up to that time of year. And you can see Jack Rayner there as well. So yeah, and Mairead is recommending her colleague Dennis Ryan's book. So thank you very much, Mairead. On that note, I'm going to wrap things up. I just mentioned plugging myself. I'd like to first of all thank all of our wonderful panelists and Laura and Shelley for all their work in organising this fantastic event, and all of our viewers for coming along as well. It's extremely appreciated. I'd like to thank the generosity as well of Shelley and Laura in allowing us to publicise this amongst our newly established Irish Network for Horror and Gothic Studies, which is an Irish-based, you don't have to be Irish, it's just to encourage people on the island of Ireland, wherever you're from, to talk about horror and encourage creativity. And if anyone's interested in knowing more about that, you can just look up Irish Network for Horror and Gothic Studies, and we're having various events and stuff. But I'd just like to again thank BAFTSS for their work in promoting this event and all the work they've put into it. So I'll hand over to Shelley and Laura, who've done incredible work here today. And again, thank our panelists. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you so much, Bernice, and thank you to Aislinn, to Mervyn, to Ellie for a brilliant conversation. Thank you for some great questions and for everybody for coming along as well. What a fantastic chat, and what a fantastic way to wrap up our year. Thank you so much. If you've been to any of our other events, or if you come in the future, we're always very happy to see you. And you can find recordings of our events, including this one soon, on our website, which Shelley's dropped a link in the chat for. We'll be back in the new academic year, but join me again in thanking everybody, and congratulations again to Ash. Thanks everybody, see you again.
Thank you.
Bye.